Harvey, thank you so much for coming and joining me and my class virtually. I know it's the end of your day in Oxford and it's the start of my day. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Claire.
So myself and the students have read your work. Obviously, you and I go way back because you were the founding director of the Institute of Cognition and Culture, which is where I did my PhD. And even before then, you actually taught me anthropology. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember you even then as an anthropology professor. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but you gave our entire class, there was about 300, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and then you kept getting us to write them down each week to see if we remembered them. So even then, your mind was already looking toward your
I
future.
remember that vividly, Claire. And the tragic thing, though, is I still can't remember the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Can you?
No, and you know
It's
this is
really hard.
what is in the first one? Suffering is inevitable.
Well, you're doing better already than I am because I can't remember the first one. And I was responsible for administering this and repeating it myself week after week, perhaps distracted. This is my excuse by other things like so organizing the sort of experimental conditions for this. But it was very difficult to learn, and people scored very poorly on their memory for that.
Well, I do remember the circumstances within which it was administered. So, there's something, and I remember it was you that gave us the test. So I don't think it was necessarily a failed experiment as far as memory is concerned. It might have,
No, it was very successful because, in many ways, because it sort of supported the hypothesis behind it, which was, namely, that people who repeat a doctrine day after day, week after week, over time, form a very clear sort of representation of the structure of the sentences and things like that. But their knowledge and understanding may not go very deep, and as a consequence, remembering the sort of underlying sort of semantic content is quite hard. Easier to sort of just repeat it parrot fashion if you learned it, as a sort of rote learned it essentially. But really, we were sort of comparing that. If I remember, this is a long time ago, but I seem to remember that experiment was looking at comparing, sort of very relatively low level of memory for the sort of doctrinal component compared with the very sort of almost ceiling levels from week 1 or 2, ceiling levels of recall for the ritualistic aspects. So people remembered the procedures, they just couldn't, and I couldn't myself remember the doctrinal content.
this was 25 years ago at least, we're talking.
That's true.
And, you know, and so let's go back further than even 25 years. Let's go back to the 80s, I believe, when you were a student in the kind of Oxbridge system. And, you decided to take yourself off to Papua New Guinea. What motivated you to go to Papua New Guinea? It's so remote and different from Western way of.
Yeah, well, the remoteness was definitely part of the appeal and the attraction for me. Sorry, Clay, let me just turn off the email because it's going to keep, can you hear it keep pinging in the background?
We're going to showcase just how busy you are if you keep that on. It's going to ping about once every 10 seconds.
Well, I mean, part of the motivation, to be honest, about getting into a sort of part of the world where there had been relatively limited and only quite recent incursion from sort of Eurasian cultures was to get a sense directly of the sort of extent to which humans vary in their different environments and cultural settings. So it was all very well as an undergraduate studying anthropology and reading lots of often quite impenetrable and dry ethnographic monographs, that didn't really tell me very much about the extent to which people with these matrilineal systems and cross-cousin marriage, whatever, how they related in a sort of fuller sense psychologically to the people of my own experience growing up in London. So I wanted to go somewhere where I had a decent chance of seeing with my own eyes and learning directly through participant observation just how different people really are. And to my astonishment and excitement, really, I found that the people in the village in Papua New Guinea, where I lived for nearly 2 years, were so very much like everyone I'd known in my earlier years growing up. And it was not that difficult. Of course, there were language barriers. There were lots of specific details to learn about the cultural environment and the physical environment. But there's a fundamental sort of common core, and it was that common core that became very interesting to me, as well as the reasons, the drivers of variation across cultures. And that's where it all began for me.
So you came from, you know, let's not forget the backdrop that you came from, which is this kind of Oxbridge, you know, system of these intellectual forefathers who made remarkable contributions to our understanding of human culture. But the role of the human mind in driving those differences was, I mean, it would be fair to say at the least underplayed, if not kind of glossed over, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there was not a great deal of interest in cognitive science. I wouldn't say there was no interest. There were anthropologists who had an interest in that. But I think, actually, to be fair, I didn't have much of an interest in cognitive science until I went out to do fieldwork, because what animated me, what excited me as a teenager in my rebellious teenage years was actually quite left-wing ideology and not sort of militant political stuff, but just the theories of left-wing thinkers. Karl Marx, for example, that may sound shocking to an American audience, but actually it was quite a normal part of the kind of 1970s, 80s London that I grew up in, and particularly Hampstead. I grew up in a sort of a part of London where there were lots of lovers and bohemians and socialists and people who, I think they called them champagne socialists at the time, people who were relatively well off and affluent, but who sort of saw themselves standing in solidarity with the workers. But I didn't really sort of buy into anything. I didn't go out marching or didn't feel particularly radicalized, but I felt that here was a theory of how human societies came to vary in the way that they did. It explained that variation, how it emerged historically. It provided a sort of a theoretical framework for understanding some deep underlying laws of human history. And I thought, when I went out to Papua New Guinea, I'd already prepared all kinds of theories to try and test, you know, that were basically testing ideas that came out of historical materialism, not out of cognitive science. And that theory kind of fell apart for me during field work, and it was very frustrating and in many ways quite upsetting. And I was looking for another set of material constraints on the way that people think and emote and behave that didn't rely on what I increasingly felt was a kind of bankrupt theory of historical materialism. So that's when I started delving into the literature in cognitive psychology. None of it was directly intended to be related to the kinds of problems I was facing in fieldwork, but bit by bit I became convinced that human memory systems place quite important constraints on what we can transmit culturally.
Yeah, I see.
What kind of things spread. Yeah.
I see this theme emerging from some of the scholars that we've spoken to, and I find it really compelling that, you know, before you go out into the field, you have a kind of theoretical framework and a set of questions. But when you get to the field, you realize that those questions aren't necessarily the most important, relevant, or interesting in that context. And so you come up with a new set of questions, but you don't necessarily have the theoretical information, the data, the knowledge about those particular questions. And so you train yourself in a whole other paradigm of research, right? In this case,
Yeah.
theories. I mean, you came back from the field and you kind of re-educated yourself in cognitive theories of memory.
Yeah, so for me, the disappointment of fieldwork, as you've described it, was like a double whammy, because on the one hand, I became convinced somewhere like halfway through the fieldwork that that the whole fundamental theory of economic determinism, which is really at the core of Marxist theory, didn't work. And actually it was logically flawed. And this was the biggest frustration for me. In a way, I felt like I should have realized this before I came out into the field. But it was it was actually engagement with real life situations and data, and trying to make things fit with the theory that brought me to the conclusion that it was fundamentally tautological and it didn't work. So that was one sort of dark night of the soul. But the second was that people I wanted to study, and whose sort of economic lives and technologies were my primary interest, weren't interested in telling me about that stuff. And they had far more interest talking to me about ritual and religion and stuff I hadn't planned to come and study. So I was not only ill-equipped, in terms of theory, but I was ill-equipped in terms of the types of readings I should have been doing before going to the field. And so I had to kind of catch up on a lot of stuff when I got back. I had loads of data. I'd got sort of half-baked theories that were starting to take shape in my mind, how it all fitted together and what I'd really learned about patterns of change in the religious groups that I'd been studying. But I really needed to ground it in something more scientific. And that's when I ended up reading a lot more psychology.
And so this was kind of your first book, Inside the Cult. Would you say this was kind of around the time that your first book?
Yeah, that's right. So Inside the Cult was kind of the book of the thesis, the classic thing that you do as an anthropologist, if you're a social anthropologist, is that you're supposed to produce a monograph as a result of the field work. And yeah, that was it. But in the process of producing that book, I'd also done quite a lot of careful thinking about how the two dimensions to the religious movement that I'd become so involved in studying, not through my own choice, as I said, but because people insisted this is what I should be studying. But as a result of that, I started to realize that there was something different about the whole kind of psychological apparatus underlying the sort of large-scale routinized dimension of the movement versus the more emotionally intense and locally cohesive kind of dimension. And I wanted to sort out why those things are so different. And even more astonishing to me was that I realized when I got back and really got deep into the literature on religion, it wasn't just the people I'd been studying in New Guinea that were like that. These two dimensions were everywhere throughout religious history. And I needed to try and get under the skin of that. What was going on? What was causing this bifurcation, if you like?
That's how excited you must have been as a young scholar, fresh-faced from your field work, seeing these patterns that you didn't choose to study, but that were literally staring you in the face.
Yes. And I was, to be honest, I was excited, yes, but I was also lonely. There was very few people to talk who were interested in this dimension. So a lot of people interested in interpretation and description of various kinds, and in obscure philosophy and all kinds of other things, but not really in scientific explanation. And it wasn't until, sort of deep into sort of writing Inside the Cult and doing other sorts of activities that I met Pascal Boyer, who was also, at a relatively early stage of his career back then in Cambridge, that I began to realize there are others like me. And Pascal introduced me to Bob Macaulay and Tom Lawson and others, Justin Barrett through Bob and others. And we came together and realized that we were sort of fellow travelers, all interested in the same set of questions and problems, and in some ways had actually arrived at very similar hypotheses from different directions. And that was even more exciting than the more lonely sort of initial phase of just trying to puzzle it together on my own.
And that phase, what you just described, was really the foundation of the cognitive science of religion, that scholars coming together. And so
I think that's right. So I think that's in fact where we came up with the term cognitive science of religion, because that's, up until that point we'd called it the cognitive conspiracy, which is not a good name at all. That was not going to catch on.
So let's talk a little bit about your unique contribution to this area called the cognitive science of religion, modes of religiosity theory. Can you summarize for those naughty students who have not done the reading, or those who just want a refresher? Let's be optimistic.
Yeah, this is just for those who want a refresher. If you haven't done the readings, go and read. No, I'm kidding. So it's a fairly simple idea at the core of it. The idea is just that, rituals are able to bind groups together, but they don't do it in just one way. In fact, they probably do it in quite a number of different ways, but there are two ways that have really interested me, and they have to do with the way collective rituals bond us together. And one way has to do with heavy repetition of a ritual sequence that allows it to stabilize across the population and to become sort of quite stuck that way over time as well. And that allows you to build some really large traditions, ones where, as part of the ritual performances, you maybe have repetitions, not necessarily the noble truths of Buddhism, which, as we discussed earlier, is not always that easy to learn. But if you do it long enough, you even manage to memorize quite complicated doctrinal concepts and narratives and other kinds of things, and also memorize the way they're all sort of joined together. And they can stabilize. And once they can stabilize in that way, you can build very, very large religious traditions. So we ended up calling this the doctrinal mode of religiosity. It's a way of being religious, or indeed of forming a group. Even this is true of non-religious groups, although that became more obvious to me a bit later on. So I've sort of labeled them modes of religiosity a bit too hastily, actually, because these are really modes of ritual and group bonding that apply to secular groups as well. But anyway, that's one way of doing it. It's sort of doctrinal. The other way of doing it is to have a really emotionally intense experience that is stored in episodic memory, that becomes part of your personal identity, and that really, when shared with other group members, produces a very powerful form of social glue. But it's a difficult one to extend to much larger groups, especially if the rituals that generate that shared experience are very localized. So it's a different kind of dynamic, very strong cohesion, but smaller groups. And that's the fundamental idea. And over the years, it's become embellished with more and more detailed sort of psychological measures and dimensions to it that we've begun to flesh out the causal story, how these things work. But that's the core of it.
Yeah, and you've been kind of systematically chipping away at the number of hypotheses generated from this theory. It's fair to say it's a broad theory. There are a lot of different hypotheses in there, and as you say, there's many different levels. And so you have again teamed up with people and retrained yourself in understanding all of these methods from, you know, biopsychosocial levels. And again, I think that's testament to your quest to really understand these problems and these questions, rather than just kind of paying testament to one particular approach or theory.
I think it sort of makes sense to look at things from multiple dimensions, because if you take these two modes of religiosity as an example, what became increasingly clear is that they have played different parts in world history. They're not just, it's not just a kind of interesting little quirk that some groups are small and very, very intensely bonded and others are more diffusely bonded but much larger. It's an important insight into how societies evolved and became bigger and bigger over time. But it's also an important way of understanding how groups behave when it comes to cooperation, particularly of an extreme kind, where self-sacrifice is required. And I'm thinking of things like intergroup warfare and other forms of conflict where you're defending your group can come at a very heavy cost personally. I think for all of these reasons, it's not enough just to sort of study the phenomenon by going off to one field site, writing a sort of little book about it, and that's the end of the matter. It became clear as we compared across lots of different groups, as we started to look at the history of them, as we started to delve into the deep prehistory and the archaeology, and as we delved deeper into the psychology, that from all of these different perspectives, we were beginning to see that these two modes were part of a much, much bigger story about humankind and about the evolution of social complexity. And yeah, it's not that I'm sort of particularly attracted to learning about new research methods. Actually, I find it a bit daunting and sometimes a bit frustrating. In practice, it can be time consuming. It feels wasteful of effort. It's very difficult to do. And sometimes it involves a certain degree of reliance on other people's skill sets when really what you want is to master all of them, but just can't. There isn't enough time or brain cells or something. And so it's not out of desire to sort of learn new methods per se. It's about the fact that the problems we want to solve cannot be solved without that sort of breadth of interdisciplinarity.
That's true, multi-interdisciplinarity, when you team up with people from different skill sets, because you realize that no one person has enough brain cells or enough skills, or that
Right.
teamwork. And that's the road less traveled, but I think it's the road that's most fruitful, even though it can be frustrating, as you say, as a researcher, to have to navigate all of these different disciplines, methods, and theories. So that's what we just talked about. It's really covered in your book, Modes of Religiosity. And there's a number of different books from Altamira Press, I believe, where you talk about, the relationship between cognitive science and anthropology and memory and ritual. Let's do the last section of the interview based on your most recent work. So can you talk us through what you've been working on most recently?
Well, most recently, our attention has turned especially to the question, what sort of practical benefits might flow from this long-term scientific project? Do the modes have any kind of real world sort of relevance, right? Is there anything we could do to make the world better as a result of what we've learned about doctrinal and imagistic modes? And I think we're beginning to see that there's some real potential there to answer that question affirmatively, and actually to develop practical interventions based on it. So I'll run through a few examples just to give you a feel. This is sort of our latest research, if you like. So, for example, where to begin? Something like our sort of efforts to harness doctrinal religions to address environmental issues. That might be an interesting place to start. We all know that all the world religions and many others besides offer some kind of doctrinal justification for stewardship of the planet, almost more than that, a sort of imperative to take care of the earth that we live on as God's creation. Very often that's the way it's represented. And yet, when it comes to major environmental threats like climate change, most of the effort to persuade people is based on scientific evidence rather than on religious rationales. That's odd when you think about it, or it's not the most practical way to proceed, given that billions of people are religious and much smaller numbers, a minority of the world's population, are scientists. So we're sort of missing an opportunity to tap into something important. We've just started a phase of research spearheaded by Adam Baimel, which has shown us that in Indonesia, at least, comparing across multiple religious groups, you can see that priming your religion's environmental concerns increases very markedly people's willingness to engage in action on environmental issues. And we can see that just simply levels of religiosity predict willingness to act on environmental issues. That's important to understand, I think. There are sort of a whole number of other related ways in which we've been looking at this. We've been looking at how the literature on cooperative conservation, the scientific literature, ignores many of the sort of most obvious sort of moral dimensions that are present in all human societies and that would be very easily activated across a lot of different cultural groups. It's a missed opportunity, and our research suggests that we could improve the way that we motivate people psychologically to get involved in conservation activities. I guess from another perspective that might be of interest to your students is that we've, especially the sports fans among them, is that we're interested in harnessing the sort of more imagistic dimensions of football fandom, because there are some very strong sort of imagistic things going on among football fans, many of them. They are bonded, we say they're fused together, their personal and their group identities get fused together, building on a construct from Bill Swan and his lab group at the University of Texas. There is a sort of bonding process that is driven by the same things we find in imagistic religions that in some cases leads to problems. It leads to intergroup conflict, you know, rival fans that fight one another. We have a bit of a problem with that in the UK. They have a much worse problem with that in some of the countries we work in, like Indonesia and Brazil, where we've been collecting data on extreme football fans. And we find that some of these patterns of extreme group commitment are very similar to what we see among religious extremists. And one project that we're working on with the former vice president of the Football Association in the UK, former vice president of Arsenal Football Club, and the guy who, I don't, people in your neck of the woods are interested in, you know, Premier League football. But some of the big figures in Premier League football have created a project over here in the UK to twin football clubs with local prisons all around the country. And they've got us involved in measuring what it is about participation in football-related activities that are sort of stimulated by the local clubs that allows prisoners to stand a better chance of going straight when they're released from prison. And we're trying to understand how potentially these sort of imagistic processes of fusion with this project and with the football activities and the values that it represents and the teams that they form contributes to that ability to reduce recidivism.
Wow, you know, it's incredible. I always think it's much easier to stay on the kind of level of theory, and when you try to use your theoretical knowledge to really change the state of the world and to make a difference and to have positive impact in such specific ways as the two ways that you have outlined. I mean, on the face of it, seemingly extremely different phenomena. Understanding climate change and preventing recidivism just seems so different, but yet, you know, these underlying unifying theories about how humans are and how they operate seems to, you've made that relevant in so many ways. I
think there's a reason why, you know, seemingly disparate problems can be solved with the same sorts of underlying theories, and that's because a lot of those problems have to do with cooperation and willingness to act for the group instead of selfishly for yourself. And so you know, what we've been studying is social glue, essentially. What is it that bonds groups together? How does it work? And how can it be harnessed to produce good outcomes? And in cases where it's actually producing consistently bad outcomes, like terrorism and other kinds of forms of violent extremism, we're interested in, well, how can we unpick some of those processes that have taken place? So it might sound like even more disparateness to say, well, we're interested in, you know, what makes a terrorist or what makes a right-wing extremist or something. But actually, these things are all related because human psychology is the same for all of them. And this is an important point. These are not like, it's not like humanity is divided up into different sort of species with the crazy people over there who do that and the normal people who do this. That way of thinking, us, them thinking, is part of the problem, not the solution. What we need to understand is we're all human, and we need to understand how our very human minds lead us down these tracks of, you know, extreme pro-group action.
Harvey, I can't think of a better way to end the conversation than at that beautiful point. Thank you for allowing me to interview you. I have to say that you interviewed me weekly for about 2 years on my Facebook.
You've turned the tables, haven't you?
Favor and an honor to be able to have you in my seat. Thank you so much, Harvey, and we're looking forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you very much. Take care.